You find yourself wondering, as the evening light fades into something softer and more forgiving, why a wizard who split his soul 7 times, who commanded armies of darkness, who made the very speaking of his name a curse upon the land, was ultimately defeated by a teenage boy with a talent for getting into trouble. The answer, you will discover tonight, lies not in the weakness of Tom Marvolo Riddle, but in the quiet strength of those who came before him and beside him, wizards and witches, whose powers ran so deep that Voldemort, for all his ambition, was merely playing at greatness while they embodied it. You settle into the comfortable mystery of this question as we begin our journey through magical history, through centuries of accumulated wisdom and power, through the lives of those who could have ended the Dark Lord's reign before it properly began, if only fate had arranged itself differently. The night is young and the story is long, and somewhere in the telling of it, you may find yourself drifting into dreams of wands and wanderings, of ancient halls and whispered spells, of a world where magic is real and where even the darkest of lords can be overcome by something as simple and as complicated as love. The history of powerful wizards stretches back millennia, you see, and Voldemort was merely one chapter in a very long book. His mistake was thinking himself the entire story. You begin to understand that the wizarding world operates on principles quite different from our own mundane realm. Power accumulates through study, yes, but also through understanding, through compassion, through the kind of deep wisdom that cannot be rushed or stolen or extracted through torture. Voldemort pursued power through fear, through the darkest of arts, through the systematic destruction of his own humanity. He believed that by making himself less human, he would become more than human. The irony, of course, is that this very pursuit made him weaker in ways he could never comprehend. Like a student who memorizes answers without understanding the underlying mathematics, he knew the forms of great magic without grasping its essence. You smile at this, perhaps, recognizing something familiar in the pattern. We have all known people who mistake credentials for competence, who confuse intimidation with influence, who believe that being feared is somehow superior to being loved. History, both magical and mundane, is littered with such figures, and they all share the same fundamental blindness. They cannot see that true power flows from connection rather than isolation, from giving rather than taking, from becoming more human rather than less. You consider now the historical parallels that illuminate this truth. In the year 1215, the Magna Carta was signed at Runnymede, a document that fundamentally altered the relationship between rulers and ruled by establishing that even kings were subject to law. This was not magic in the sense of wands and incantations, but it was transformative nonetheless. King John believed his power came from divine right and military force. The barons who confronted him understood that legitimate authority requires consent, that a ruler who governs through fear alone builds on sand. Voldemort made the same miscalculation 7 centuries later. He surrounded himself with Death Eaters bound by fear and dark marks, by threats against their families and promises of punishment for failure. Such followers will serve while you are watching and flee the moment you look away. True loyalty, the kind that Dumbledore inspired, the kind that made Snape spend 17 years in mortal danger for love of a woman long dead, cannot be compelled. It must be earned. You find this comforting somehow. The tyrants of history, magical and mundane alike, always seem to forget this lesson, and they always pay the price for their forgetfulness. You turn your attention to scholarly debates that have occupied magical historians for centuries. Among the most contentious is the question of whether magical power is innate or developed, whether great wizards are born or made. The evidence, frustratingly, points in both directions. Some witches and wizards display extraordinary abilities from childhood, performing accidental magic of such magnitude that it seems impossible they could ever be ordinary. Others bloom late, showing little promise until some transformative experience unlocks their potential. Voldemort himself was exceptional from the start, displaying control over his magic even before he knew magic existed. Yet Neville Longbottom, dismissed as nearly a squib in his early years, grew into a wizard capable of defying the Dark Lord to his face and destroying a Horcrux. The debate continues in academic circles, with proponents of the inheritance theory pointing to magical family lines, and proponents of the cultivation theory emphasizing education and experience. Perhaps, you think drowsily, the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps we're all born with certain potentials, but the realization of those potentials depends on circumstances beyond our control and choices entirely within it. The thought is oddly reassuring. It suggests that greatness is not predetermined, that the story is not written until we write it. You encounter, now, a quirky historical detail that brings a sleepy smile to your face. In the 15th century, a wizard named Emmerich the Evil briefly possessed the Elder Wand, that most powerful of magical artifacts. His reign of terror lasted precisely 2 years before he was defeated by Egbert the Egregious, whose name suggests that perhaps magical parents were no better at naming their children than modern ones. One imagines young Egbert on the playground, explaining to the other wizard children that yes, his parents really did name him that, and no, he doesn't know why. And yes, he's heard all the jokes already. The name Egbert derives from the Old English words for bright and edge, suggesting a shining sword, but this nuance was likely lost on a boy whose surname meant outstandingly bad. That such a unfortunately named individual would go on to defeat a Dark Lord is rather encouraging. It suggests that destiny pays little attention to what we are called, focusing instead on what we do. Voldemort chose his own name, of course, rearranging the letters of his birth name into something he considered grander. He never could accept being merely Tom Riddle. The universe, with its characteristic sense of humor, ensured that he would be defeated by people who were perfectly comfortable being called things like Harry and Ron and Hermione. You learn another quirky detail that delights in its specificity. The wizarding world, for all its magical advancement, was remarkably slow to adopt certain innovations that Muggles had long since embraced. The self-inking quill, for instance, was not invented until 1823, meaning that for centuries, even the most powerful witches and wizards were constantly dipping their quills into inkwells like medieval monks, getting ink stains on their fingers, and occasionally smudging important documents. Merlin himself, if the legends are to be believed, probably spent a non-trivial percentage of his day dealing with ink-related inconveniences. This humanizing detail reminds you that even the greatest magical beings are still, in many ways, just people. They stub their toes and catch colds and occasionally put their robes on inside out when they're running late. Voldemort, one suspects, never stubbed his toe after becoming the Dark Lord. He was probably floating slightly above the ground at all times just to maintain his image. This commitment to aesthetic evil must have been exhausting. You almost feel sorry for him. Almost. You consider a second scholarly debate that has puzzled magical theorists for generations. This concerns the nature of magical creatures and whether their magic differs fundamentally from wizard magic or merely represents a different expression of the same underlying force. House elves, for instance, can apparate within Hogwarts where wizard apparition is impossible. Phoenix tears can heal wounds that no spell can cure. Unicorn blood can sustain life in ways that defy normal magical understanding. Some scholars argue that these abilities prove creature magic operates on entirely different principles. Others contend that all magic derives from a single source, and that creatures simply access it through different channels than wizards do. The practical implications of this debate are significant. If creature magic is fundamentally different than combining it with wizard magic, might produce entirely unprecedented effects. If it's all the same magic, then the differences are merely cultural and educational. Voldemort, characteristically, never showed much interest in this question. He used creatures when they for cultures and they served his purposes and discarded them otherwise. He bound himself to Nagini but never tried to understand snake magic. He commanded Dementors without wondering what they truly were. This lack of curiosity was another weakness, another limitation he imposed upon himself in his quest for power. You smile at the first of our light jokes, thinking about how Voldemort must have felt about administrative tasks. Even Dark Lords have paperwork. Somewhere in his rise to power, he had to organize raid schedules, manage Death Eater disputes, and probably deal with expense reports for all those black robes. One imagines him at a desk, muttering about how Lucius Malfoy's submitted receipts are always late, and how Bellatrix keeps requisitioning more silver masks than she could possibly need. The glamour of evil tends to fade when you consider the logistics. You chuckle softly at a second joke. Consider that Voldemort spent significant resources Sebastis Hofanfokutar Asin Sin Samatemsio Ikilntar Basachis Itavanto Baosus Dusnirds when he could have just asked around at the Wandmaker community. Wand allegiance is apparently Wandmaker gossip. Everyone knew Dumbledore had it. A simple inquiry might have saved him months of searching, but Dark Lords never like asking for directions. A third joke surfaces as you drift. Voldemort's inability to understand love as magic is rather like a fish being unable to understand water. He was swimming in it his whole life without ever recognizing what surrounded him. The magic that protected Harry, that bound Snape to his promise, that made the Order of the Phoenix function was all around him, and he dismissed it as weakness. It would be funny if it weren't so sad. You encounter another historical fact that grounds our magical tale in real-world parallels. In 1666, the Great Fire of London destroyed much of the medieval city, including St. Paul's Cathedral and over 13,000 houses. The fire burned for 4 days and displaced tens of thousands of people. Magical historians have long debated whether the fire had supernatural components. Some argue that a failed magical experiment contributed to its severity. Others maintain it was purely mundane in origin. What is certain is that the wizarding community was affected just as much as the Muggle population. Diagon Alley, located in London, required significant reconstruction in the fire's aftermath. The disaster forced magical and non-magical communities into closer cooperation than usual, as both worked to rebuild their respective domains. Voldemort, centuries later, would exploit the separation between these communities, hiding his activities in the gaps between worlds. If the fire taught any lesson, it was that isolation makes everyone more vulnerable. Walls between communities do not protect. They merely ensure that when disaster strikes, help is slower to arrive. You drift toward a fourth light joke. Imagine being a Death Eater and having to get that dark mark tattoo. There's presumably some magical tattoo artist who specializes in skull and snake imagery. One wonders about his other clients. Does he have a portfolio? Do people ever ask for modifications? Perhaps one Death Eater wanted his mark to be slightly more symmetrical, and another thought the snake should be smaller, and Voldemort had to send out a memo establishing that no, the design is final. Stop bothering the artist. A fifth joke emerges lazily. The Hogwarts house system essentially sorts children based on a personality test administered by a hat. Imagine trying to explain this to a Muggle psychologist. They spend years developing validated instruments with controlled studies, and wizards just plop a magical hat on children's heads and let it decide their social groups for the next 7 years. Voldemort was sorted into Slytherin, of course, because the hat recognized his ambition and cunning. One wonders if there was ever a moment of hesitation, a brief consideration of Ravenclaw for his obvious intelligence. Probably not. The hat knows what it knows. A sixth joke settles over you like a warm blanket. Consider that Voldemort's greatest fear was death, and he spent his entire life doing things that made people want to kill him. This is rather like being terrified of bee stings and choosing a career in beekeeping. The internal contradiction never seemed to occur to him. You settle deeper into the story as the first section draws toward its close. The night stretches before you, full of wizards and wanderings, full of history both real and imagined, full of gentle ironies and profound truths wrapped in the language of magic. Voldemort's weakness was not any single failing, but a constellation of blindnesses. He could not understand love, could not value loyalty freely given, could not see that power divorced from wisdom is merely destruction waiting to happen. The wizards who could have defeated him, and the one who finally did, all understood something he never grasped. Magic is not about control. It is about connection. The most powerful spell ever cast was not some terrible curse or transformative incantation. It was a mother's love freely given, asking nothing in return except that her child might live. Against such magic, all the Horcruxes in the world are merely dust and shadows. You hold this thought gently as we prepare to move to the next section, where Albus Dumbledore awaits in his tower office, surrounded by whirring instruments and sleeping portraits, knowing perhaps more than anyone what power truly means. You find yourself ascending the spiral staircase to the headmaster's office, each step taking you higher into the understanding of why Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore was perhaps the only wizard of his age whom Voldemort genuinely feared. The gargoyle has already moved aside at your approach, recognizing somehow that you belong here in this moment of telling, and the moving staircase carries you upward past stone walls that have witnessed 1,000 years of magical education. At the top, the door opens onto a circular room filled with strange silver instruments that whir and emit puffs of smoke, with portraits of former headmasters pretending to sleep in their frames, with a magnificent phoenix perched upon a golden stand, and with the man himself seated behind his desk, half-moon spectacles reflecting the candlelight, those piercing blue eyes seeming to look through you and beyond you into something larger. You settle into a comfortable chair that has appeared without being summoned because the room knows what you need before you know it yourself, and you prepare to learn about power held gently, about wisdom earned through terrible mistakes, about a wizard who spent his entire life atoning for the ambitions of his youth. You begin to understand Dumbledore's power by understanding first what he had survived. In his youth, he formed a friendship with Gellert Grindelwald, a wizard of extraordinary brilliance and equally extraordinary darkness. Together they dreamed of wizard domination over muggles, of reshaping the world according to their superior understanding. The partnership ended in tragedy when Dumbledore's sister Ariana died during a three-way duel between Albus, his brother Aberforth, and Grindelwald. Dumbledore never knew whose curse killed her. He carried that uncertainty for the rest of his life, along with the crushing guilt of knowing that his ambitions had contributed to her death. This trauma transformed him. The young man who had dreamed of power became an old man who distrusted power, especially his own. He was offered the position of Minister for Magic multiple times and refused each time, preferring to shape the world through education rather than governance. Some scholars have criticized this choice, arguing that a Minister Dumbledore could have prepared the magical world far better for Voldemort's rise. Others maintain that his influence as Hogwarts headmaster was ultimately more profound. You consider this debate as the firecrackles, finding wisdom in the uncertainty itself. You learn about Dumbledore's magical abilities, which were extraordinary by any measure. He was the only wizard Voldemort ever feared, and for good reason. Dumbledore had mastered every branch of magic, from transfiguration, which he taught before becoming headmaster, to alchemy, which he studied with Nicholas Flamel. He could cast spells of such complexity that other wizards struggled to comprehend them. He could produce a Patronus corporeal enough to carry messages. He could see through deceptions that fooled everyone else. His duel with Grindelwald in 1945 is considered one of the greatest magical battles ever fought, lasting for hours and destroying significant portions of their surroundings. Witnesses described magic they had never seen before and would never see again. When it ended, Dumbledore was victorious and Grindelwald was imprisoned in Nurmengard, the very fortress he had built to hold his enemies. The victory gave Dumbledore possession of the Elder Wand, the most powerful wand in existence. Though he never sought to use its power for domination, he kept it hidden, using it only when necessary and even then with restraint. This, perhaps more than any single ability, demonstrated his true strength. He could resist the temptation that the wand presented. You encounter a historical fact that illuminates Dumbledore's era. In 1945, the same year he defeated Grindelwald, World War II ended in the Muggle world. The connection between these events has been debated by magical historians for decades. Some argue that Grindelwald was allied with Muggle dictators, using their conflicts as cover for his own operations. Others maintain that the magical and mundane conflicts were entirely separate, merely coinciding in time. The evidence supports partial overlap at minimum. Grindelwald was known to be operating in continental Europe during the war years. His slogan, "For the greater good," echoed the rhetoric of totalitarian regimes. The destruction he caused was often attributed to Muggle bombing by those unaware of the magical world. Dumbledore's decision to finally confront his former friend came after years of hesitation. He feared, perhaps, discovering the truth about Ariana's death. He feared what defeating Grindelwald would cost him personally. But by 1945, the cost of inaction had grown too high. The parallel to Voldemort's later rise is striking. In both cases, the magical world waited too long to confront a growing threat. In both cases, the cost in lives was enormous. You settle into understanding another historical fact that shaped Dumbledore's world. The International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy was established in 1689 and 1692, formalizing the separation between magical and non-magical communities. This was not merely administrative convenience. It was a response to centuries of persecution, to witch trials and burnings, to the very real danger that Muggles posed to wizards when fear overwhelmed reason. The Salem witch trials of 1692 directly influenced the statute's implementation. In the American colonies, the hysteria resulted in the execution of 20 people and the accusation of over 200 others. Most of those killed were not magical at all, but the panic demonstrated what could happen when Muggle society turned against perceived witchcraft. Dumbledore spent his career navigating the implications of this separation. He believed strongly in the statute's necessity while recognizing its limitations. Voldemort's contempt for Muggles was, in some ways, a dark reflection of the fear that created the statute in the first place. Both responses, separation and domination, emerged from the same historical wound. Dumbledore sought a middle path, respecting Muggle dignity while maintaining necessary boundaries. It was a delicate balance, and not everyone agreed with his approach. You discover a quirky historical detail about magical dueling that brings a smile to your face. The formal dueling tradition that Dumbledore mastered includes elaborate bowing protocols that vary significantly by region. British wizards bow at precisely 15 degrees, French wizards at 20 degrees, and there was a famous international incident in 1847 when a Romanian delegate bowed at what witnesses described as an aggressively shallow angle. The diplomatic crisis that followed took 3 months to resolve and resulted in the International Magical Cooperation Department creating a 40-page guide to appropriate bowing. Dumbledore, characteristically, could adjust his bow precisely to any regional expectation, having memorized the entire guide as a young man and updated his knowledge throughout his career. Voldemort, by contrast, probably never bowed to anyone in his life, which may explain why his international support was always somewhat limited. Even dark wizards appreciate proper etiquette. You learn another quirky detail that suggests the magical world's particular strangeness. Dumbledore's famous love of sherbet lemons was not merely personal preference. In the early 20th century, there was a brief period when sherbet lemons were believed to enhance magical cognition. The theory, since thoroughly debunked, held that the combination of sugar and citrus acid stimulated the same neural pathways used in wandless magic. For about 20 years, serious magical researchers consumed enormous quantities of the candy, convinced they were enhancing their abilities. Dumbledore apparently developed his taste during this period and simply never stopped. Some historians argue this demonstrates his humility. He knew the theory was wrong, but continued the practice anyway, finding genuine pleasure in a habit that had begun as misguided science. Others suggest it shows his sense of humor. Perhaps he enjoyed watching younger wizards try to decode the secret of his power, never guessing that the sherbet lemons were entirely irrelevant. You smile at the image of students solemnly eating candy, hoping to become more like their headmaster. You consider a scholarly debate that has occupied magical ethicists for decades. This concerns Dumbledore's use of information withheld. Throughout Harry's education, Dumbledore possessed knowledge that could have changed everything. He knew about the prophecy from the beginning. He suspected the nature of Voldemort's soul magic. He understood what Harry would eventually have to do, yet he revealed this information slowly, strategically, letting Harry discover truths at carefully planned moments. Some scholars argue this was necessary manipulation. Harry needed to develop certain qualities before he could handle certain knowledge. Telling a child he must eventually die would serve no constructive purpose. Others contend that Dumbledore treated Harry as a tool rather than a person, that the withholding of information was a form of control, inconsistent with genuine respect. The debate touches on fundamental questions about wisdom and responsibility. When is it ethical to let others walk into danger? When does protection become manipulation? You find no easy answers, only the recognition that Dumbledore himself struggled with these questions throughout his life. You encounter another scholarly debate, this one concerning Dumbledore's relationship with the Deathly Hallows. He possessed the Elder Wand for over 50 years. He wore the Resurrection Stone, disguised as a ring after retrieving it from the Gaunt's house. He never possessed the Invisibility Cloak, but he knew where it was and who owned it. Some scholars argue that Dumbledore was actively trying to become Master of Death, pursuing the same legend that fascinated him in his youth, merely with more patience and subtlety. Others contend that his relationship with the Hallows was coincidental, or that he kept them to prevent them from falling into worse hands. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the complexity between simple explanations. Dumbledore was a man of tremendous depth, capable of holding multiple motivations simultaneously. He could genuinely want to protect the Hallows from misuse, while also, in some quiet corner of his brilliant mind, wondering what would happen if he ever united all three. You smile at the first of our light jokes about Dumbledore's eccentricities. His office contained numerous strange devices whose purposes he never fully explained. One whirred constantly and emitted smoke at irregular intervals. Another made small squeaking sounds when significant events occurred in the castle. Harry once asked what a particularly elaborate silver instrument did, and Dumbledore gave an answer that explained nothing while sounding profound. One suspects this was intentional. Dumbledore probably collected devices specifically because they were mysterious and enjoyed watching people try to figure them out. The greatest wizard of his age, amusing himself by being needlessly cryptic. It's rather endearing. You drift toward a second joke. Dumbledore's fashion sense was, by any objective measure, eccentric in the extreme. Purple robes with silver moons, hats of improbable height, buckles on his boots that served no apparent function. In the Muggle world, he would have been escorted from most establishments within minutes. In the Wizarding world, his eccentricity was tolerated because of his power. This raises interesting questions about the relationship between genius and acceptable behavior. Newton was famously difficult. Einstein wore no socks, and Dumbledore apparently believed that more tassels equaled more wisdom. Perhaps there is something to it. You chuckle softly at a third joke. Dumbledore's office required a password to access, and he apparently chose candy names for these passwords. Sherbet Lemon, Cockroach Cluster, Acid Pops. Imagine being a Death Eater trying to infiltrate Hogwarts and having to say Fizzing Whizbee to a stone gargoyle with a straight face. The dignity of evil suffers in such moments. Voldemort would never have tolerated such whimsy. His headquarters probably required something properly intimidating, like a blood oath or a dark incantation. Dumbledore's candy passwords were a small rebellion against taking oneself too seriously. You arrive at a fourth joke. Despite being the most powerful wizard alive, Dumbledore had to attend faculty meetings and presumably deal with interdepartmental conflicts between professors. Imagine mediating a dispute between Snape and McGonagall about classroom allocation, or listening to Professor Binns complain about students falling asleep during his lectures. Even the Master of Death cannot escape administrative tedium. The thought of Dumbledore nodding politely while someone reviews the annual budget for quill supplies is strangely humanizing. You encounter a fifth joke. Dumbledore lived for over 150 years and remained employed at the same school for most of it. The magical world apparently has no mandatory retirement age, which means Hogwarts teachers can technically teach forever. Professor Binns is literally a ghost and still gets paid, presumably. This creates interesting questions about job mobility in the wizarding economy. How do young professors find positions when the old ones never leave? The system seems designed for stagnation. Perhaps this explains why magical society changes so slowly. Everyone in charge has been in charge for centuries. You settle into a sixth joke. Dumbledore's brother Aberforth ran a pub and was once prosecuted for performing inappropriate charms on a goat. The details of this incident have never been fully revealed, and one suspects they never should be. The most powerful wizard of his age had a brother who got in trouble over goat magic. Every family has its stories. You consider Dumbledore's power in context. He could have defeated Voldemort directly. He had the skill and the knowledge, but he recognized something crucial. A hero who wins all the battles creates dependency rather than strength. If Dumbledore had simply eliminated Voldemort, the magical world would have learned nothing except that Dumbledore would always save them. Instead, he prepared others to fight. He built the Order of the Phoenix. He trained Harry. He created the conditions for victory rather than delivering victory himself. This was wisdom of the deepest kind. True power is not doing everything yourself. It is empowering others to do what needs to be done. Voldemort could never have understood this. For him, power meant control, meant being the one who acts rather than the one who enables action. He would have seen Dumbledore's approach as weakness. In the end, this misunderstanding cost him everything. You drift toward the section's end, carrying with you the image of an old man in a tower office, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of a long and complicated life. Dumbledore made terrible mistakes. He pursued power in his youth. He failed to protect people he loved. He kept secrets that perhaps should have been shared. But he learned from his mistakes. He became someone who could hold the Elder Wand without being corrupted by it, who could watch a young boy walk toward death without flinching from the necessity. That transformation from ambitious young genius to wise old guardian is perhaps the most powerful magic of all. It is available to everyone. It requires no wand, no incantation, no special talent, only the willingness to acknowledge error and grow from it. You hold this thought gently as we prepare to move backward in time to another powerful wizard who chose a darker path, to Gellert Grindelwald waiting in his European fortress, dreaming of a world remade according to his terrible vision. You step through time itself, traveling backward through decades of magical history until you find yourself in the streets of Nurmengard, approaching the prison fortress that Gellert Grindelwald built to hold his enemies and which now holds only him. The irony of this reversal was not lost on the man imprisoned within, a man who once dreamed of reshaping the entire world and who now spends his days in a cell of his own construction, watching through narrow windows as the world he tried to conquer goes on without him. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. The fortress rises against the alpine sky like a monument to ambitions that grew too large, its walls enchanted with protective magic that Grindelwald himself designed, its towers reaching toward clouds that seemed to gather specifically to darken its silhouette. You enter, passing through wards that recognize your purpose as that of a storyteller rather than a threat, and you find him in the highest cell, an old man now, his famous golden hair turned silver, his piercing eyes still holding something of the brilliance that once made him the most dangerous wizard in the world. You learn about Grindelwald's history and the power he commanded. He was expelled from Durmstrang Institute, a school already known for its permissive attitude toward dark magic, which suggests that his explorations exceeded even very generous boundaries. The nature of his transgression has never been officially confirmed, but rumors speak of experiments on fellow students, of magic that pushed into territories even Durmstrang considered forbidden. After his expulsion, he came to Godric's Hollow, where he encountered Albus Dumbledore, and for one brilliant, terrible summer they were inseparable. They shared a vision of wizard supremacy, of casting off the chains of secrecy, of leading Muggles to their proper subordinate place for what they called the greater good. Grindelwald was the driving force behind this philosophy, but Dumbledore was not an unwilling participant. They fed each other's ambitions. They pushed each other toward darker conclusions. The partnership ended with Ariana Dumbledore's death and Grindelwald's flight from Britain. He would spend the next decades building his power base in continental Europe, gathering followers, constructing Nurmengard, preparing for the transformation he believed inevitable. You consider Grindelwald's magical abilities, which rivaled and perhaps exceeded those of any wizard of his era except Dumbledore himself. He was a master of every magical discipline, but his particular genius lay in magical theory, in understanding the deep principles underlying spells rather than merely memorizing their forms. This theoretical understanding allowed him to innovate in ways other wizards could not match. He could modify spells in real time, adapting them to circumstances. He could combine magical effects in unexpected ways. His dueling style was unpredictable, precisely because he was not following established patterns, but creating new ones as he fought. Most impressively, he wielded the Elder Wand with devastating effectiveness after stealing it from the wand maker Grigorovich. The wand recognized his ambition and his skill. For over 40 years, he was undefeated in single combat until Dumbledore finally confronted him in 1945. You encounter a historical fact that grounds Grindelwald's story in real-world context. The period of his greatest power coincided with the rise of fascism in Europe. Mussolini took control of Italy in 1922. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Franco began the Spanish Civil War in 1936. The Muggle world was descending into chaos, and Grindelwald saw this chaos as opportunity. He built alliances with magical communities across the continent, promising them liberation from secrecy, promising them the power they deserved over the Muggles who feared them. His rhetoric echoed the totalitarian movements surrounding him, but with a magical twist. Where Muggle dictators spoke of racial purity, Grindelwald spoke of magical superiority. Where they promised national greatness, he promised wizard dominion. The International Statute of Secrecy, he argued, was a form of oppression, forcing magical people to hide their true nature. This argument found receptive audiences among those who had chafed under secrecy's restrictions. You learn another historical fact that reveals the scope of Grindelwald's influence. The First Wizarding War, as magical historians would later call it, stretched across continental Europe for over 2 decades. Grindelwald controlled significant magical territories in Germany, Austria, and Eastern Europe. He commanded armies of followers who believed genuinely in his vision. The magical death toll was enormous, though exact numbers remain disputed. International magical cooperation, never robust, collapsed entirely under the pressure. The International Confederation of Wizards, established to coordinate magical governance globally, became irrelevant as individual ministries struggled simply to protect their own territories. Only Britain, protected by the English Channel and by Dumbledore's presence, remained relatively unscathed. This geographical luck would later contribute to British magical society's sometimes provincial attitudes, a tendency to view continental concerns as fundamentally foreign. You discover a quirky historical detail about Grindelwald's personal habits. Despite his dark reputation, he was a vegetarian, having given up meat after a youthful encounter with a sentient pig named Herbert in the German countryside. The experience apparently left him with a lasting inability to consume anything that might have had a name. His followers found this dietary restriction somewhat inconvenient, as dark wizard gatherings traditionally feature robust, meat-heavy feasts. Grindelwald's insistence on vegetable-forward menus was reportedly a source of quiet grumbling among his lieutenants. The image of Europe's most dangerous wizard carefully inspecting canapes to ensure no animal products have sneaked in is delightfully humanizing. Evil, apparently, has its limits. You learn another quirky detail that illuminates Grindelwald's complexity. He kept the extensive library of Muggle literature and philosophy, reading widely in German, French, English, and Latin. His particular favorite was Nietzsche, whose concept of the Übermensch he interpreted through a magical lens. He annotated his copies extensively, arguing in margin notes with authors dead for centuries. When his fortress was finally captured, investigators found a complete set of Proust, all carefully read and marked. They also found a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, which Grindelwald apparently considered a masterpiece of social observation. The complexity of a dark wizard who could appreciate Jane Austen while planning magical domination resists easy categorization. Perhaps this is precisely the point. Real people, even terrible ones, contain multitudes. You consider a scholarly debate that has occupied magical historians. This concerns whether Grindelwald genuinely believed his rhetoric about wizard superiority or whether it was merely a tool for gaining power. The evidence supports genuine belief. His private correspondence, recovered after his defeat, shows consistent ideology across decades. He wrote to Dumbledore about the greater good long before he had followers to impress. He maintained his views even in prison, where no political advantage remained possible. Yet genuine belief does not excuse the consequences. Millions suffered under his rule. Families were destroyed. Communities shattered. The sincerity of his convictions made him more dangerous rather than less, because it meant he could not be bought off or distracted. He pursued his vision with the absolute commitment of the true believer. You encounter another scholarly debate, this one concerning Grindelwald's relationship with the Deathly Hallows. He was obsessed with them from an early age, adopting their symbol as his personal mark. He stole the Elder Wand specifically to unite the Hallows. Yet, he never managed to acquire the other two, and scholars have questioned whether this failure was coincidental or significant. Some argued that Grindelwald's soul, corrupted by dark magic and ambition, could never have mastered the Resurrection Stone or the Cloak of Invisibility. These hallows, they suggest, require a certain purity of intent that Grindelwald lacked. Others maintain that he simply ran out of time. If Dumbledore had delayed another decade, if Grindelwald had found the stone before his defeat, history might have ended differently. The counterfactuals are terrifying to contemplate. You smile at the first of our light jokes. Grindelwald apparently had a famous problem with doors. According to witnesses, he could never quite remember whether they opened inward or outward, leading to numerous embarrassing moments where the most feared wizard in Europe pulled when he should have pushed. His dramatic entrances were occasionally undermined by this spatial confusion. One imagines his followers averting their eyes politely while he struggled with a particularly stubborn handle. Even Dark Lords have their mundane embarrassments. You drift toward a second joke. The symbol of the Deathly Hallows, which Grindelwald adopted as his mark, is essentially a triangle with a circle and a line inside it. Modern analysts have pointed out that this could be mistaken for various mundane symbols, including certain traffic signs and several corporate logos. Grindelwald would have been horrified to learn that his mystical symbol would eventually be used by a chain of organic grocery stores in California. You chuckle at a third joke. Grindelwald's prison, Nurmengard, was designed to be inescapable, with no provision made for the possibility that its creator might end up inside it. This is the magical equivalent of building an email server with no reply function. The hubris is almost impressive. Did he really never consider that things might not go according to plan? The optimism of tyrants is a fascinating psychological phenomenon. You encounter a fourth joke. After his defeat, Grindelwald spent over 50 years in solitary confinement, with no visitors except eventually Voldemort seeking the Elder Wand's location. One imagines decades of absolute boredom. Did he compose mental poetry, replay chess games in his head, count the stones in his cell wall? The practical reality of life imprisonment is rarely considered in magical narratives. There is no glamour in counting ceiling cracks. You arrive at a fifth joke. Grindelwald and Dumbledore were the same age and apparently competed academically during the summer they spent together. According to later accounts, Dumbledore was slightly better at transfiguration while Grindelwald excelled at charms. They apparently kept score. The eventual fate of the wizarding world was influenced by two teenage boys trying to impress each other with magical one-upmanship. History turns on such mundane hinges. You settle into a sixth joke. Grindelwald's famous phrase, "for the greater good," was inscribed above the entrance to Nurmengard. After his defeat, the magical authorities considered removing it, but decided the irony was too perfect to disturb. Every prisoner who entered or left would see the words that had justified their jailer's crimes. The universe's sense of humor is occasionally quite pointed. You consider what made Grindelwald a genuine threat to Voldemort. Unlike the later Dark Lord, Grindelwald could inspire genuine loyalty. His followers believed in him, not merely feared him. They shared his vision of a transformed world. Some of them fought to the death defending that vision, not because they feared punishment, but because they could not imagine living in a world where the dream had failed. This capacity for inspiration made Grindelwald in some ways more dangerous than Voldemort. Armies motivated by fear fight only as long as fear compels them. Armies motivated by belief fight until belief is extinguished. You learn that Grindelwald, at the very end, refused to tell Voldemort where the Elder Wand was hidden. This final act of defiance has puzzled scholars. What motivated a man who had committed countless atrocities to suddenly refuse a request? Some argue that Grindelwald experienced genuine remorse during his decades of imprisonment. Others suggest that his hatred of Voldemort, another dark wizard claiming the mantle Grindelwald once wore, exceeded his desire for any possible advantage. Perhaps he simply enjoyed denying Voldemort something. After 50 years of powerlessness, this small act of defiance may have been the only satisfaction available. Whatever his motivation, the refusal cost him his life. Voldemort killed him in his cell, and Grindelwald went to death without revealing his final secret. You consider that Grindelwald, for all his evil, was in some ways a more interesting figure than Voldemort. He could love at least in his fashion. His relationship with Dumbledore was genuine, complex, and influential on both men's lives. He could appreciate beauty as his literary interests demonstrate. He could inspire rather than merely terrify. He pursued a vision of the world as he thought it should be, rather than merely pursuing power for its own sake. None of this excuses his crimes, but it suggests that the capacity for greatness and the capacity for terrible evil are not mutually exclusive. The same qualities that could have made Grindelwald a force for good, his brilliance, his charisma, his conviction, became instruments of destruction when directed toward dark ends. You drift toward the section's close, leaving Grindelwald in his high cell, an old man staring at walls he built to imprison others. The fortress that was meant to house his enemies became his eternal home. The symbol he chose to represent his vision became a mark of shame. The movement he created collapsed entirely after his defeat. History has rendered its verdict, and it is not favorable. Yet even here, in the story of failure and imprisonment and death, there are lessons worth remembering. Power without wisdom is destructive. Conviction without humility is dangerous. The greater good is never served by treating people as means rather than ends. Grindelwald learned these lessons too late, or perhaps never learned them at all. You carry them with you as we travel further backward in time, past centuries of magical history, to the founding of Hogwarts itself, where 4 extraordinary wizards and witches created something that would outlast empires. You emerge from the mists of deep time into a landscape that seems to exist halfway between history and dream, where the boundaries between what happened and what was believed to have happened blur into something richer than either alone. And you realize that you have arrived in the age of Merlin, the most famous wizard who ever lived, whose name has echoed down through centuries of mundane and magical memory alike, becoming so encrusted with legend that the actual man beneath has become almost impossible to perceive. The Britain you see around you is post-Roman. The legions long departed, their roads still running straight across the countryside but beginning to crumble without the maintenance that kept them whole, their towns shrinking back into the landscape, their language mixing with local tongues to create something new. This is the age of petty kingdoms and uncertain borders, of warlords calling themselves kings, and genuine nobility living in conditions that later centuries would consider primitive. And somewhere in this chaos, a wizard emerged whose power and influence would never be matched. You encounter immediately the problem of separating fact from legend where Merlin is concerned. The magical historical record is clear that he existed. His name appears in documents from multiple independent sources. Artifacts attributed to him retain magical signatures consistent with the period. But the details of his life have been so embellished, so mythologized, so incorporated into Muggle Arthurian legend that the original truth has become almost irrecoverable. Some scholars have attempted to strip away the accretions to find the historical Merlin beneath the legendary one. Others argue that this project is misguided, that Merlin's legend is itself a kind of truth, representing how the magical community wanted to remember him. You find yourself appreciating both perspectives as you walk through this liminal landscape where history and myth interweave. You learn what can be reliably established about Merlin's magical abilities. He was, by all credible accounts, the most powerful wizard Britain has ever produced. His wandless magic exceeded anything contemporary practitioners could achieve. He could transfigure massive objects, redirect rivers, raise structures from nothing. His prophetic abilities, while inconsistent, produced verifiable predictions documented centuries before their fulfillment. His understanding of magical theory was so far beyond his contemporaries that they could not distinguish between his accomplishments and miracles. He lived in an age before systematic magical education, before the codification of spells, before the development of most magical theory, and yet he achieved things that modern wizards, with all their accumulated knowledge, cannot replicate. You consider how Merlin's power compares to what we know of Voldemort's. The comparison is instructive. Voldemort pursued power through destruction, through the systematic elimination of anything that threatened him, through dark magic designed to break rather than build. Merlin's power, as far as the records show, was primarily constructive. He advised kings, he protected communities, he created lasting works of magical engineering. The standing stones of Britain, many scholars believe, were positioned under his guidance for reasons that remain partially mysterious. Whatever else Merlin was, he was a builder. His legacy is things that still exist, not things he destroyed. This orientation toward creation rather than destruction may be the most significant difference between them. You encounter a historical fact that grounds Merlin's era in real events. The post-Roman period in Britain, traditionally dated from roughly 410 CE, when the legions departed, to 597 CE, when Augustine arrived to convert the Anglo-Saxons, was marked by demographic catastrophe and cultural transformation. Roman Britain had been relatively prosperous, with urban centers, international trade, and a literate administrative class. Within a century of the Roman departure, most of this had collapsed. Towns emptied, trade routes closed, the knowledge of reading and writing became rare. Into this chaos came new peoples, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, pushing the Romanized British population westward. The wizarding community was not immune to these upheavals. Magical knowledge was lost. Training systems collapsed. Merlin emerged during this period of chaos, his extraordinary abilities allowing him to preserve and transmit magical knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. You learn another historical fact about early medieval magic. Before the development of modern wand-making techniques, magical practice relied on focus objects of tremendous variety. Some wizards used staffs, others used rings or amulets. A few achieved wandless magic through sheer force of will. Wands, as we know them, carefully matched to their users through trial and selection, did not become standard until well after Merlin's time. He apparently used a staff of English oak, carved with symbols whose meanings have been lost, and also demonstrated the ability to cast without any focus at all. This flexibility suggests a relationship with magic fundamentally different from what modern practitioners experience. Ollivander's famous assertion that the wand chooses the wizard would have puzzled Merlin. For him, magic was not mediated through any object. It simply was. You discover a quirky historical detail about Merlin's daily life. According to a fragmentary text discovered in a Welsh monastery and subsequently sold to a private collector whose identity remains unknown, Merlin was unusually fond of apples and apparently believed they possessed magical properties beyond their nutritional value. He carried apples with him constantly, offered them to visitors, and may have planted orchards across southern Britain that survived for centuries after his death. This apple obsession has never been adequately explained. Some scholars connect it to Celtic mythology, where apples feature prominently. Others suggest a more prosaic explanation that Merlin simply enjoyed apples, and the later tradition sought mystical justification for a mundane preference. You learn another quirky detail that suggests the complexity of life in Merlin's era. The wizard apparently maintained a complicated relationship with owls whom he found judgmental. While modern wizards use owls routinely for mail delivery, Merlin preferred ravens, finding their personalities more agreeable. A 9th century text describes his conviction that owls were watching him specifically and keeping notes. Whether this represents genuine magical sensitivity, paranoid eccentricity, or simple personal preference has been debated. The magical world eventually standardized on owls for communication, suggesting that Merlin's raven preference did not take hold. Perhaps owls won the argument through persistence. You consider a scholarly debate about Merlin's relationship with the Muggle king Arthur. The traditional narrative, familiar from countless retellings, places Merlin as Arthur's advisor and protector, guiding the young king through his early reign, establishing the Fellowship of the Round Table, and eventually being imprisoned by the enchantress Nimue. Magical historians have questioned virtually every element of this narrative. Some argue that Arthur himself is entirely legendary, a fusion of multiple historical figures into a single idealized king. Others accept Arthur's historicity but question whether Merlin's relationship with him was as close as legend suggests. The evidence is frustratingly incomplete. What seems clear is that Merlin engaged with Muggle political affairs to a degree unusual for wizards of any era. He did not hide from the mundane world, but participated in it actively. You encounter another scholarly debate about the circumstances of Merlin's death or disappearance. The traditional legend has him imprisoned forever in a cave or crystal tower by his student Nimue, whom he loved and who betrayed him. Magical historians have proposed alternative explanations. Perhaps he chose to withdraw from the world, retreating to study magic in solitude. Perhaps he died of natural causes and the imprisonment legend developed to explain why no body was ever found. Perhaps he achieved some form of magical transcendence that took him beyond ordinary existence. One particularly controversial theory suggests that Merlin discovered something about the nature of magic itself that made continued existence as an ordinary wizard impossible or undesirable. The truth, if it exists, has been lost. You smile at the first of our light jokes. Merlin's reputation for prophecy has created a cottage industry of attributed predictions, most of which are almost certainly fraudulent. He allegedly predicted the Norman Conquest, the Black Death, the Great Fire of London, both world wars, and the invention of the television. Given that these predictions emerged suspiciously close to the events they supposedly foretold, their authenticity is questionable. Merlin's actual prophecies, documented in texts contemporary with his life, are vaguer and less impressive, suggesting that the future is harder to see clearly than legend implies. You drift toward a second joke. The Isle of Avalon, where Arthur was supposedly taken after his final battle, has been identified with dozens of locations across Britain, each claiming authentic Arthurian connections. Glastonbury has perhaps the strongest claim, having conveniently discovered Arthur's grave in 1191, just when the monastery needed funds for reconstruction. The monks showed remarkable archaeological fortune in finding not only Arthur's remains, but a helpful lead cross identifying them. Medieval tourism was apparently just as creative as the modern variety. You chuckle at a third joke. Merlin's legendary backwards aging, living his life in reverse with memories of the future, has created numerous logical paradoxes that delight philosophers and annoy everyone else. If he remembered tomorrow but forgot yesterday, how did he learn anything? How did he form relationships? The legend probably developed to explain his prophetic abilities, but it raises more questions than it answers. Time is complicated enough without wizards making it worse. You encounter a fourth joke. The magic word abracadabra, beloved of Muggle stage magicians, supposedly derives from an Aramaic phrase meaning "I create as I speak." Merlin almost certainly never said it. The word's association with magic postdates his era by centuries. Yet somehow his image has become linked with the phrase in popular imagination. One imagines Merlin watching Muggle magic shows and sighing at how his legacy has been reduced to pulling rabbits from hats. You arrive at a fifth joke. King Arthur's sword. Excalibur, in some legends forged by Merlin, was supposedly given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake. This raises questions about aquatic governmental systems that Monty Python famously explored. Merlin, as a political advisor, apparently saw nothing unusual about legitimizing royal authority through random women distributing swords from bodies of water. Medieval political theory was apparently quite flexible. You settle into a sixth joke. Merlin's traditional pointed hat has become the standard image of wizardly headwear, yet there's no evidence he actually wore one. The pointed hat association developed centuries after his death, possibly influenced by the hats worn by accused witches during persecution periods. Merlin might be quite surprised to see what people think he looked like. Perhaps he preferred sensible caps. You consider what Merlin's power means for understanding Voldemort's place in magical history. Voldemort believed himself the most powerful wizard of his age, perhaps of any age. Against Dumbledore alone, this claim was dubious. Against Merlin, it becomes laughable. Merlin shaped the course of Muggle history. He preserved magical knowledge through a civilizational collapse. He became so legendary that Muggles who don't believe in magic know his name. Voldemort will be remembered as a terrorist eventually defeated by his own blindness. The comparison reveals the pettiness of Voldemort's ambitions. He wanted power over the magical world. Merlin's power touched everything. You also consider the dangers of romanticizing Merlin. The sources that praise him were not objective historians. They had their own agendas. Whatever his genuine accomplishments, the legendary Merlin has been shaped by centuries of wishful thinking, of desire for a golden age when magic was stronger and wizards were nobler. Perhaps the historical Merlin was petty, arrogant, politically manipulative. Perhaps his famous wisdom developed through catastrophic mistakes he learned from. We cannot know. The past's opacity should make us humble about the present. The wizard's future generations remember may not be the ones we expect. You drift toward the section's close, leaving Merlin's misty era behind, carrying questions rather than answers. Who was he really? What did he actually accomplish? Why did he matter so much that his name has outlasted empires? These questions have no definitive answers. Perhaps that is appropriate. The greatest wizard who ever lived should remain somewhat mysterious. His power derived partly from his mystery. If we could fully explain him, he would be diminished. You accept the uncertainty as we prepare to meet another wizard whose power derived from a very different source, from the accumulation of centuries of study, from the endless patience of immortality. Nicolas Flamel awaits, 600 years old and still curious, still learning, still growing in wisdom. That time makes possible. You enter an alchemist's workshop where the boundaries between science and magic dissolve entirely, where bubbling retorts share space with enchanted manuscripts, where the smell of sulfur mingles with the indefinable scent of transformation itself, and you realize that you have found Nicolas Flamel, the only wizard in recorded history to successfully create the Philosopher's Stone and thus achieve what every alchemist dreamed of, but none before him accomplished. The workshop is cluttered in the particular way of spaces occupied by minds too busy thinking to organize, with notebooks stacked on notebooks, with experiments in various stages of completion covering every horizontal surface, with books open to relevant pages, and then forgotten when another question became more pressing. Flamel himself looks perhaps 60, not young but hardly ancient, preserved by his creation at an age that suggests maturity without decline. His eyes hold 6 centuries of accumulated observation. His hands, steady despite their years, continue to work even as he acknowledges your presence. You learn the basic facts of Flamel's extraordinary biography. Born in France around 1330, he was originally a manuscript seller and notary, occupations that gave him access to texts from across Europe. According to his own later accounts, he acquired a mysterious alchemical text, the Book of Abraham the Jew, which contained coded instructions for creating the Philosopher's Stone. He spent over 20 years decoding this text, traveling to Spain to find scholars who could help him interpret its Hebrew passages, and finally, around 1382, achieved success. From that point forward, he and his wife Perenelle possessed the ability to create the elixir of life and transmute base metals into gold. They used their wealth philanthropically, building hospitals, schools, and churches. They were believed to have died in the early 15th century, but magical historians have long suspected this death was staged. You consider what 6 centuries of life would do to a wizard's magical development. Voldemort sought immortality but never achieved it. He barely reached his 70s before his final death. Flamel, by contrast, lived through the Black Death, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, and the rise of the modern magical world. He witnessed the founding and development of every modern magical institution. He knew Dumbledore personally, working with him on alchemy. He had time to master every magical discipline, not through brilliance alone, but through the simple accumulation of practice. A wizard who spends a decade studying transfiguration becomes proficient. A wizard who spends a century becomes master. A wizard who spends 6 centuries achieves things that faster-living practitioners cannot imagine. You encounter a historical fact that contextualizes Flamel's early life. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in 1347-1351, killed approximately 1/3 of the European population. France was devastated. Paris, where Flamel lived, lost perhaps half its inhabitants. The social fabric was torn apart. Labor shortages transformed economic relationships. The authority of the church was questioned as prayers proved ineffective. Flamel survived this catastrophe, possibly because the philosopher's stone's creation predated the plague, or possibly through mundane luck. Either way, the experience shaped him. He had seen civilization nearly collapse. He had watched neighbors die in agony. He understood in a way that shorter-lived wizards cannot just how fragile human achievements are. This understanding informed everything he did afterward. You learn another historical fact about medieval alchemy and its relationship to magic. Before the establishment of the International Statute of Secrecy, the boundaries between magical and mundane scholarship were more permeable. Muggle alchemists pursued the Philosopher's Stone alongside magical ones. They shared texts, shared techniques, shared the fundamental belief that matter could be transformed through proper understanding and application of principles. The separation between chemistry and alchemy, between science and magic, developed later. Flamel existed in a world where these distinctions had not yet hardened. His achievement was not purely magical in the modern sense. It combined what we would now call magical and scientific approaches, integrating knowledge from multiple traditions. This synthetic quality may explain why no one has successfully replicated his work. You discover a quirky historical detail about Flamel's relationship with his wife Perenelle. They apparently spent significant portions of their extended lives engaged in elaborate pranks against each other, a centuries-long competition of increasingly sophisticated magical tricks. According to sources close to the couple, Perenelle once transformed Nicholas's entire workshop into cheese, an achievement that took him 3 weeks to reverse. He retaliated by teaching all the birds in their neighborhood to sing her name off-key every morning. These pranks continued across centuries, becoming a form of love language, a way of reminding each other that even eternal life should not be taken too seriously. You learn another quirky detail that humanizes this legendary figure. Flamel maintained a comprehensive diary throughout his extended life, recording not profound philosophical insights, but mundane observations about the changing world. He documented the introduction of the fork to France, noting with apparent distaste that younger generations seemed to find eating with their hands primitive. He recorded the first time he encountered coffee, which he described as bitter water that makes sleep impossible and thought too rapid. He tracked fashion changes across 6 centuries, generally disapproving of each new development. This diary, portions of which have been made available to magical historians, reveals a personality both engaged with and slightly bewildered by a world that kept changing around him. You consider a scholarly debate about whether Flamel could be considered the most powerful wizard in history. The case for him rests on longevity and accomplishment. He achieved something, the Philosopher's Stone, that no other wizard has replicated. He had more time to develop his abilities than anyone else. He mastered multiple magical disciplines. Yet some scholars argue that raw magical power is not the same as magical achievement. Perhaps Flamel succeeded not because he was unusually powerful, but because he was unusually patient, unusually methodical, unusually willing to fail and try again across decades. Power and persistence are different qualities. The debate connects to larger questions about what we mean by magical ability and how it should be measured. You encounter another scholarly debate about Flamel's decision to destroy the Philosopher's Stone shortly before his death in the 1990s. After 6 centuries of life, he and Perenelle concluded that they were ready to die. They could have continued indefinitely. They chose not to. Some scholars view this as the ultimate wisdom, the recognition that eternal life is not necessarily desirable, that death gives life meaning. Others see it as tragic waste, the loss of 6 centuries of accumulated knowledge that could have benefited future generations. Still, others suspect the decision was not entirely voluntary, that the stone's powers were failing, or that Flamel discovered something about immortality that made him unwilling to continue. The full truth may never be known. You smile at the first of our light jokes about Flamel's extended life. After 6 centuries, he had apparently run out of small talk topics. When meeting new people, he would often forget that stories about events from the 1400s were not relatable. Conversations would stall as he realized his audience had no frame of reference for his anecdotes. He eventually developed a repertoire of timeless observations about weather and food that could function across any century. You drift toward a second joke. Flamel's gold-making ability apparently caused him significant inconvenience. Every few decades, he had to construct elaborate explanations for his continued wealth. He established fake inheritance chains, created fictional relatives, and maintained a collection of forged documents proving non-existent family connections. Immortality, it turns out, involves a lot of paperwork. You chuckle at a third joke. The Philosopher's Stone required the elixir of life to be consumed regularly to maintain immortality. This meant Flamel and Perenelle could never be too far from their supply. Vacations had to be planned around elixir availability. Extended travel required careful packing. One imagines the stress of realizing halfway across the world that you forgot to pack the immortality juice. You encounter a fourth joke. Flamel witnessed the development of the wand-making industry, from craft tradition to standardized manufacturing. He apparently found modern wands too fussy, preferring older, simpler focus objects. Every few decades, some eager young wand-maker would try to interest him in the latest innovations, and he would politely explain that he was quite satisfied with what he had. Old wizards never want to update their magical equipment. You arrive at a fifth joke. After several centuries, Flamel had apparently developed strong opinions about which historical periods were overrated. The Renaissance, in his view, was mostly self-promotion. The Enlightenment was people taking credit for what alchemists already knew. Only someone with direct experience of these eras could dismiss them so casually. You settle into a sixth joke. Flamel and Perenelle's extended marriage raises interesting questions about relationship dynamics over centuries. Did they ever consider separation? How do you maintain romantic interest after 600 years? The sources suggest they managed through a combination of separate hobbies, regular pranks, and an agreement never to discuss the same topics more than once per decade. You consider what Flamel's power means in comparison to Voldemort's. Both sought immortality. Only Flamel achieved it. More importantly, Flamel achieved it through creation rather than destruction. He made something new, something that could have benefited others if he had chosen to share it. Voldemort tore his own soul apart, diminishing himself in pursuit of continuation. Their methods reflected their characters. Their outcomes reflected the justice that reality sometimes provides. The wizard who built lived for 6 centuries and chose his own ending. The wizard who destroyed barely reached normal human lifespan before being killed by his own reflected curse. You also consider what Flamel could have taught Voldemort if Voldemort had been capable of learning. Flamel knew that power is not an end in itself. He used his abilities philanthropically. He sought understanding rather than dominance. He maintained loving relationships across centuries. He remained curious, humble, open to new experiences. Everything Voldemort lacked, Flamel possessed. Everything Voldemort wanted, Flamel achieved and eventually chose to release. The contrast is almost too perfect, as if the universe arranged it specifically to illustrate a moral point. You drift toward the sections close, leaving Flamel's workshop as the candles burn lower and the alchemical fires dim. 6 centuries of life and what remains. Hospitals that still help the sick, schools that still educate the young, a stone that no longer exists. A couple who chose together to let their long story end. The echoes of a life well lived persist after the life itself has ended. Voldemort sought to live forever and left only fear. Flamel sought to understand and left compassion. You carry this contrast with you as we prepare to explore the hidden corners of magical history, the overlooked and the obscured, the powerful witches and wizards who chose anonymity over fame. In the margins of recorded history, extraordinary beings await discovery. You find yourself drawn away from the famous figures who dominate magical history into the quieter quarters, where those who possess tremendous power but chose obscurity have always dwelt, hidden from the narratives that prefer dramatic heroes and terrifying villains. Content to exercise their gifts without the complications of recognition, and you realize that the most complete picture of magical power must include those who deliberately avoided being pictured at all. History, whether magical or mundane, remembers those who sought to be remembered. The names that echo down through centuries are names attached to public deeds, to recorded achievements, to deliberate participation in the stories we tell ourselves about our past. But for every Dumbledore who stepped forward, there were perhaps dozens of equally capable witches and wizards who stepped back. Their powers were no less real for being undocumented. Their influence, though untracked, may have been equally significant. You encounter the fundamental problem of studying those who did not wish to be studied. The evidence, by design, is sparse. We know they existed because of occasional references in the writings of those who did seek recognition. A letter from Bathilda Bagshot mentions an elderly witch in Albania whose mastery of wandless magic exceeded anything she had witnessed. A journal entry from an 18th century Department of Mysteries worker describes a hermit in the Scottish Highlands who could communicate with weather patterns as easily as most people communicate with each other. Footnotes in obscure texts hint at achievements that would have made their practitioners famous if they had chosen fame. These fragments suggest a hidden history running parallel to the documented one, a tradition of powerful witches and wizards who prioritize solitude over significance. You consider why magical practitioners might choose obscurity. The reasons are various. Some distrusted the political entanglements that came with recognition. Others found social interaction draining and preferred quiet study. Some had been burned by early experiences with fame and retreated deliberately. Others simply did not value recognition, finding sufficient reward in the work itself. A few seem to have possessed abilities so unusual that public acknowledgement would have created more problems than benefits. The witch, who can see 3 minutes into the future, has an impressive power, but announcing it invites endless requests and impossible expectations. Better to remain unknown. You encounter a historical fact about the deliberate suppression of magical knowledge. Not all obscurity was voluntary. Throughout magical history, those who threatened established power structures have been systematically erased from the record. The International Confederation of Wizards maintains archives documenting witches and wizards whose memories were modified, whose works were destroyed, whose very existence was rendered forgotten. Some of these individuals were dangerous criminals, others were researchers whose discoveries threatened political stability. The line between protection and suppression was not always clear. These deliberately forgotten figures may have included wizards whose power exceeded anything now remembered. We have no way of knowing. You learn another historical fact about informal magical education. Before and alongside Hogwarts and similar institutions, magical knowledge was transmitted through informal networks of practitioners who shared techniques without seeking credit. These networks operated across national boundaries, across social classes, across the gaps between magical and Muggle societies. A wand maker's apprentice in Germany might learn from a hedge witch in Poland who had learned from a traveling scholar from Morocco. The knowledge that accumulated in these networks was substantial, but unattributed. When formal magical education institutionalized, much of this knowledge was incorporated without acknowledgement. The anonymous contributors to magical understanding number in the thousands. You discover a quirky historical detail about a 19th century witch known only as the Brighton Anomaly in Department of Mysteries records. She apparently possessed the ability to perceive the emotional residue left in physical objects, sensing the feelings of everyone who had ever touched a particular item. This ability, sometimes called psychometry, is not unknown in magical circles, but hers was reported to be extraordinarily powerful. She could touch an ancient coin and experience the emotions of dozens of previous handlers, stretching back centuries. The talent seems to have been more burden than gift. She avoided public spaces where the accumulated emotional residue of countless people became overwhelming. She lived at the end of the Brighton Pier, where the objects around her were relatively new and therefore less emotionally charged. You learn another quirky detail about an obscure figure from magical history. In the 16th century, a wizard who called himself only Fortunato achieved local fame in what is now northern Italy for his ability to improve luck, not predict the future, not change probabilities through magic, but actually make things go slightly better for people in his vicinity. Crops grew more successfully. Accidents were avoided. Fortunate coincidences occurred more frequently. The effect was subtle but documented through decades of comparative records. When Fortunato died, the region's agricultural yields dropped measurably for a decade. No one has since replicated his ability. Some scholars have questioned whether it was magical at all, or simply a community placebo effect powered by collective belief. You consider a scholarly debate about whether magical power follows a normal distribution. The question is whether most wizards cluster around average ability with few extremes, or whether the distribution is more varied, with significant numbers at both high and low ends. Those who argue for normal distribution suggest that magical education evens out natural differences, raising low performers and reaching the limits of high performers. Those who argue for wider distribution point to figures like Merlin and Dumbledore, whose abilities seem discontinuously greater than their contemporaries. The debate has implications for how we understand magical potential. If power follows normal distribution, then education and opportunity are the primary determinants of magical achievement. If it follows a wider distribution, then innate talent plays a larger role. You encounter another scholarly debate about the role of magical genetics versus magical environment. This connects to earlier discussions but focuses specifically on the overlooked and the obscured. Why do some wizarding families produce generations of notable practitioners while others fade into obscurity? Is it inherited talent, or is it the accumulation of knowledge, resources, and expectations passed down through families? The anonymous powerful witches and wizards challenge simple answers. Many came from undistinguished backgrounds. Many had no formal training. Whatever power they possessed arose through paths that standard explanations cannot account for. You smile at the first of our light jokes about obscure magical figures. There exists in ministry archives a classified list titled Wizards Who Could Probably Have Been Dangerous If They Had Wanted to, but Just Didn't Feel Like It. The list is over 200 names long. Entry criteria include demonstrable magical ability, significantly above average, and documented lack of ambition to use it for anything particularly impressive. One entry notes a wizard who could apparently teleport without wands or incantations, but used this ability primarily to avoid having to walk upstairs. You drift toward a second joke. An 18th century witch in Cornwall was famous locally for her ability to make any baked good perfectly delicious. Her scones were transcendent. Her pasties drew visitors from 3 counties. She refused all offers to commercialize her talent or teach it to others, insisting that magic should not be used for profit. She was arguably one of the most practically skilled magical practitioners of her generation, and she used her gifts for pastry. You chuckle at a third joke. Ministry records contain a file on a wizard who could apparently talk to doors. Not unlock them magically, but literally convince them to open through conversation. The transcripts of his interactions with various doors are oddly compelling. He had developed an entire philosophy around door psychology, arguing that most doors simply wanted to be appreciated for their role in architecture. His insights were useless for practically every other magical endeavor. You encounter a fourth joke. A 20th century magical hermit in Siberia reportedly developed spells of tremendous power, but refused to write them down because he believed documentation was asking for trouble. He allegedly could summon and dismiss blizzards at will, communicate with wolves over vast distances, and render himself invisible to both magical and muggle detection. His magical innovations died with him because he was also convinced that paper was untrustworthy. Paranoia apparently limits one's scholarly legacy. You arrive at a fifth joke. The International Confederation of Wizards once attempted to compile a census of magical practitioners worldwide. The project was abandoned after 7 years when they realized that the most powerful witches and wizards were specifically avoiding being counted. The census data they did collect is therefore skewed toward those who cooperated, which probably excludes exactly the population they were most interested in documenting. You settle into a sixth joke. A Victorian-era witch in Scotland invented a spell that could perfectly predict what her cat wanted at any given moment. She considered this her greatest magical achievement. When Department of Mysteries officials visited to document her other abilities, which were rumored to be considerable, she spent the entire interview explaining feline psychology. They left without the information they sought, but with an extensive education about cat behavior patterns. You consider what the obscured and overlooked suggest about Voldemort's place in magical history. He sought fame, power, fear, recognition. He wanted his name to be known, his deeds remembered, his power acknowledged. The anonymous powerful chose differently. They possessed abilities that might have matched or exceeded his, but felt no need to prove it. In some ways, their choice represents the ultimate victory over the kind of ego that drove Voldemort. He needed validation from others. They needed nothing from anyone. The wizard who quietly tends her garden, whose magical abilities could devastate armies but who prefers growing vegetables, has achieved something Voldemort never understood. Never. She is free. You also consider the practical implications. Voldemort, for all his power, was ultimately limited by his need for confrontation. He had to challenge, had to dominate, had to prove himself superior. This need made him predictable. He would pursue the Elder Wand because its possession would confirm his supremacy. He would attack Hogwarts because defeating Dumbledore's school would cement his legend. The obscure powerful have no such vulnerabilities. They cannot be baited, cannot be manipulated through ego, cannot be drawn into battles they do not choose. If one of them had decided to oppose Voldemort, they could have done so from complete anonymity, striking without warning and retreating without trace. You drift toward the sections close, acknowledging the limits of what we can know. The overlooked powerful leave no monuments. The obscured gifted grant no interviews. We catch glimpses through fragments and footnotes, suggestions and shadows. But their very obscurity teaches something important. Power does not require an audience. Ability does not demand recognition. The greatest magic may be that which goes unwitnessed, exercised in private, shared with no one, leaving no trace except the quiet satisfaction of the practitioner. You carry this humbling thought as we prepare for our final section, where the threads of our long journey will weave together into something like understanding, where the question of power will resolve into something simpler and more profound, where sleep approaches with the gentleness of a gift freely given. You arrive at last at the end of our long journey through magical history, through centuries of accumulated power and wisdom and terrible mistakes, through the lives of wizards and witches whose abilities shaped the world and whose stories have illuminated this gentle evening. And you find yourself understanding something that perhaps you knew all along but needed to be reminded of in the telling. The question we began with was, who could defeat Voldemort? We have met Dumbledore, whose power exceeded the Dark Lord's and whose wisdom exceeded it by even more. We have met Grindelwald, whose brilliance and darkness mirrored Voldemort's in uncomfortable ways. We have met the founders of Hogwarts, whose collaborative magic created an institution that outlasted empires. We have met Merlin, whose legendary power redefined what magic could mean. We have met Nicholas Flamel, whose patience achieved what Voldemort's violence never could. We have met the obscured and the overlooked, whose anonymous abilities remind us that power need not seek recognition. Each of them, in their own way, exceeded Voldemort. Each of them possessed something he lacked. You settle into the gentle irony that runs through this entire story. Voldemort was defeated not by any of the mighty wizards we have discussed, not by accumulated centuries of power, not by legendary abilities or ancient wisdom, but by a mother's love and a teenage boy's stubborn courage. Lily Potter's sacrifice, freely given, created protection that Voldemort could never overcome. Harry's willingness to walk into death without resistance rendered him invulnerable in ways that transcended magical categories. The most powerful dark wizard of his age, he who must not be named, the one who inspired terror across the magical world, was undone by what he dismissed as weakness. Love, sacrifice, the willingness to die for others. These are not magical disciplines taught at Hogwarts. They cannot be mastered through study. They cannot be acquired through ambition. They are available to everyone or no one, depending on choices that have nothing to do with innate ability. You consider what this means for understanding magical power. The wizards we have discussed were all impressive by conventional measures. They could cast spells of tremendous force. They could manipulate reality in ways that defy mundane comprehension. They commanded respect, fear, admiration. Yet the magic that actually defeated Voldemort was older and deeper than any of their abilities. It operated through love rather than control. It worked by giving rather than taking. It required no wand, no incantation, no training. A Muggle mother could have cast it. A squib could have cast it. Anyone who loved someone enough to die for them carried this magic within them always. You encounter a historical fact that grounds are ending in the real world you will return to when sleep finally comes. The word love appears in some of the earliest human writings that survive. Sumerian poetry from 4,000 years ago speaks of love between partners, love between parents and children, love between friends. The emotion we call love has been central to human experience for as long as we have records. Voldemort's inability to understand it was not magical peculiarity, but human failure. He cut himself off from something that defines our species. His power grew as his humanity diminished, and ultimately his power was worthless because it was built on nothing. You learn another historical fact that connects magical and mundane understanding. The ancient Greeks distinguished between multiple types of love, using different words for each. Eros was romantic love, passionate and consuming. Philia was friendship, the affection between equals. Storge was familial love, the bond between parents and children. Agape was unconditional love, asking nothing in return. Lily Potter's sacrifice was agape, perfect and complete, expecting nothing, offering everything. This categorization reminds us that love is not one thing, but many. Each powerful in its own way, each capable of creating magic that transcends individual ability. You discover a quirky historical detail that brings a sleepy smile to your face as you drift toward rest. In the 17th century, a wizard named Alberic Grunion attempted to catalog every type of magical protection and rank them by effectiveness. His list included over 400 categories, from elaborate ward systems to simple amulets. At the very end of his otherwise comprehensive catalog, he added a note that he suspected love-based protection might be more powerful than anything else, but that he could not figure out how to study it systematically. This admission of limitation from an obsessive cataloger suggests that even those who sought to understand everything recognized that love exceeded their categories. You learn another quirky detail that closes the circle of our journey. Dumbledore apparently kept a small collection of items on his desk that had been touched by love-based magic. A pocket watch that had been held by a dying father as he thought of his children. A letter written by lovers who would never see each other again. A child's drawing given as a gift. These objects had no practical magical value. They could not be used for spells. But Dumbledore seems to have found them meaningful, perhaps as reminders of what truly mattered, perhaps as anchors against the temptations of power that he understood better than almost anyone. You consider a scholarly debate that will not be resolved, but that is worth contemplating as sleep approaches. This concerns whether magic that works through love is truly magic at all, or whether it represents something else entirely. Something that uses magical vocabulary but operates on different principles. Some scholars argue that love-based protection demonstrates that magic is fundamentally about connection, that all magical power derives ultimately from relationships between beings. Others maintain that love-based magic is exceptional, categorically different from other magical effects, not explainable through standard magical theory. The debate touches on the deepest questions about what magic is and where it comes from. You encounter another scholarly debate, gentler this time, suitable for the quiet moment we have reached. This concerns what lessons magical education should draw from Voldemort's defeat. Some argue that Hogwarts and similar institutions should incorporate love-based magic into their curricula, teaching students to cultivate the emotional connections that generate true protection. Others contend that love cannot be taught, that attempting to systematize it would destroy its essential quality. Perhaps both positions contain truth. We cannot teach people to love, but we can create environments where love flourishes. We can model loving behavior. We can remind students that the magic most worth having is available to everyone, requiring no special talent, demanding only the willingness to care. You smile at our first light joke of this final section, gentle enough for near sleep. Voldemort spent decades seeking immortality through increasingly desperate means while surrounded by followers who feared rather than loved him. If he had simply been nicer, some of them might have protected him out of genuine affection, which would have been far more effective than any Horcrux. Evil makes poor strategic choices. You drift toward a second joke, softer still. The wizarding world has never developed a formal greeting that acknowledges love's power. There is no magical handshake that says, "I genuinely care about you and would sacrifice for your well-being." Perhaps there should be. It would be more useful than most magical innovations. You chuckle quietly at a third joke. Harry Potter, the boy who defeated Voldemort, had terrible grades in several subjects and was primarily distinguished by his ability to find trouble. The savior of the wizarding world was a mediocre student who won through love rather than skill. There is hope for all of us. You encounter a fourth joke, warm and fading. Dumbledore's famous assertion that love is the most powerful magic of all has been printed on countless greeting cards, posters, and motivational materials throughout the wizarding world. He would probably find this commercialization amusing. The greatest truth reduced to wall decoration. You arrive at a fifth joke, nearly dream now. If love is truly the most powerful magic, then everyone who has ever loved is more magical than they knew. Parents watching their children sleep carry within them protective power that dark lords cannot match. This thought is funny only in its unexpected profundity. You settle into a sixth joke, barely a whisper. The entire magical world, with all its wands and spells and centuries of accumulated knowledge, was saved by a baby. Tom Riddle must have found this deeply irritating. You feel the gentle approach of sleep now as our wind-down begins, the longest and softest part of our final section, and you let the tension of attention begin to ease from your shoulders, from your neck, from the small muscles around your eyes that have been working to hold images in place throughout our long journey together. The story is ending, but the ending is not an absence, not a stopping, but a transformation into something else. Into the quiet space where dreams live. Where the wizards we have met tonight may visit you in forms shifted by sleep's strange logic. Dumbledore may appear with his half-moon spectacles and his gentle smile, offering lemon drops that taste of wisdom. Merlin may walk beside you through mists that feel like possibility. The founders may welcome you to a Hogwarts that exists only in dreaming, where the staircases lead where you need them to lead. The candles are burning lower now in this room that exists between waking and sleeping, and the shadows they cast are friendly shadows. The darkness they leave is comfortable darkness. The silence they create is the kind of silence that wraps around you like a familiar blanket. You have traveled so far tonight, through centuries and across continents, through legend and history and the spaces between them. Your mind has held wizards and witches of tremendous power, has considered questions of love and sacrifice, has wandered through castles and workshops and misty landscapes where magic is as common as breathing. Now it is time to let all of that settle, to let the images sink into the deeper places where memory stores what it wishes to keep. The night outside your window continues regardless of our story, stars wheeling in patterns that ancient astronomers named for heroes and monsters, the moon traveling its patient path across the sky, clouds perhaps drifting in from whatever direction clouds come from in your particular corner of the world. Somewhere in that night, in the imagination where magic is real, the wizarding world continues its existence parallel to ours, students sleeping in their dormitories, professors grading papers by candlelight, house elves preparing breakfast in great kitchens where copper pots reflect the firelight. The world we have visited tonight does not end because our visit ends. It simply continues without us, as it always has. As it always will. Your breath is slowing now, deepening, finding the rhythm that belongs to rest rather than attention, and this is good. This is exactly as it should be. The questions we raise tonight do not require answers before sleep. They can wait. They will be there tomorrow if you want them, or they can fade like morning mist if you prefer, leaving only the gentle warmth of having spent time in good company in the presence of stories that matter, even if we cannot say exactly why. Love is real. Sacrifice is meaningful. The powers that truly matter are available to everyone. These truths do not need analysis. They simply are. You may dream tonight of wands and wanderings, of great halls and hidden passages, of portraits that move and staircases that change and a hat that sings and sorts. Or you may dream of nothing you remember, which is also fine, which is also complete. Sleep does its work, whether we witness it or not. The restoration happens in the darkness, in the quiet, in the spaces between one thought and the next, where thought itself dissolves into something deeper. The wizards who could defeat Voldemort have gathered tonight to share their wisdom, each in their own way, reminding us that power is not what we often imagine it to be, that the greatest strengths are often the gentlest ones, that love is not weakness, but the deepest magic there is. They have done their work for this evening. Now they too rest in the places where legendary figures go when we stop telling their stories, waiting until the next time we need them, patient as only those who have already shaped history can be. Let your eyes close if they have not already. Let your body find its comfortable position, the one that belongs uniquely to you. Let the last words of this story fade like the last notes of a familiar song, not with a sense of ending, but with a sense of completion, of having arrived somewhere worth arriving. Tomorrow will bring its own adventures, its own questions, its own opportunities to choose love over fear, sacrifice over selfishness, courage over convenience. But tomorrow is not yet here. Tonight belongs to rest. Sleep well, traveler. Sleep well and dream of magic.